Before you get started painting loose watercolor flowers like a pro, let's dive right into talking about the supplies and tools that you need to be able to succeed. You technically can paint with whatever supplies you already have, but for the very best results, I'm going to show you what a difference having higher quality supplies can have on your success. Watercolor paper is everything because it's the foundation for your painting. Having the right paper really does make a difference in the results you see. I have several different brands here to show you: Canson, Fabriano, Strathmore, Blick Premium, and Arches. If you don't have access to these brands, don't worry. I've provided a cheat sheet of brands that I love, but also what to look for when you're out buying your art supplies. There are a lot of factors that go into a good, high-quality watercolor paper, but here's what you're looking for. Artist grade, 100% cotton, and at least 140 pounds. Student grade paper just doesn't hold up as well as artist grade. The artist grade is also archival paper, which means it's acid-free and it's designed to last a really long time. Student grade paper is known to dry quickly and to create those really hard lines once your paint has dried. But if you choose a higher grade to start off with, you won't have as much of a problem. 100% cotton paper is important because it makes the paper really strong. I use a lot of water and many layers in my paintings, and the 100% cotton paper holds up really well. I don't know if you've ever noticed your paper start to ball up, warp, or bubble when you're painting. This is because it's not as sturdy and it just won't hold up nearly as well. The weight of the paper is really important because a heavier paper will be able to absorb more water. You'll want at least 140-pound paper, or 300 grams. You also need to consider the texture of your paper. The main textures you need to focus on are hot press and cold press watercolor paper. It's really a personal preference thing, so it's up to you what you choose here. I personally prefer cold press because I feel like it absorbs the water much better than hot press. If you prefer the look of beautiful bleeds in your watercolor painting, you'll want to go with cold press. Hot press is really great for detailed work or if you want to scan in your artwork later. Try both out and see what you prefer. You can buy watercolor paper on pads, blocks, in sheets, or rolls. I typically will buy either pads or blocks just because that's what works for me, but again, it's really a personal preference thing. If you buy your paper loose, you'll want to tape down your paper before you start painting. This is to help keep the painting flat so that as it dries, it doesn't curl or bubble as much. I've painted these circles on each of the papers. I've kept each of the paint and brushes used exactly the same, I just changed up the paper. And you can really see the difference. In these lower grade papers, you can see those little blooms that happen when the paint doesn't dry evenly, and it creates this hard line. The blends are not as seamless as with the high quality paper. The high quality paper like this Arches paper blends out so nice and it doesn't have that hard line, which I love. You really can paint on whatever paper you have available or whatever you can afford, but I wanted you to see the difference because you'll have much better results with the nicer paper. One question I get a lot is if I practice on cheaper paper or if I only use my Arches paper for my nice finished paintings. Honestly, I would practice with what you plan to paint on for your finished piece. I have found that if I practice on a cheaper paper before moving to the more expensive paper, I'm getting such different results that it didn't really help me to practice in the first place. If I'm using the inexpensive paper, I'll use it for a color study or for a quick watercolor sketch to decide where I'm going to place things. Then I can move on to my finished painting and I have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to do with my nice paper. If I want to practice on my nice paper, what I'll do is save the paintings that didn't go as well, and I'll either paint on the back or paint in some of the leftover white spaces to swatch out colors or to practice something before I put my paint to my finished paper. There are so many brushes to choose from. Long handle, short handle, natural hair bristles, synthetic bristles, round, flat, angled, detail, and not to mention all the sizes the brushes come in. There are a lot of options. I've tried so many brushes and it really comes down to the round brush for me. I love round brushes because they're so versatile and you can really paint any loose flower you want with just a few different sizes. I also want to point out that there are two types of round brushes, round and pointed round. We will be using round brushes in this class. Pointed round is a little bit narrower and has more of a point to the brush tip, so it'll create sharper, pointed petal rather than a more rounded petal. We can always create points with the round brush, but we can't as easily create a rounded shape with the pointed round brush. So we're just going to make life easy and stick with the regular round brush. My all-time favorite brand is Princeton. They are affordable and really high quality. They have a lot of different lines within the brand, but I prefer their Heritage line. The brushes have a synthetic bristle, which means the brush has a better bounce back, and I'm able to have more control and to get more out of the brush than if I were to use one with natural hair bristles. Depending on how you hold the brush is where you'll see its versatility. We'll get more into that in a future lesson. For this class, you'll really want 3 different sizes of round brushes. Small, between size 0 and 4, medium, between size 8 and 12, and large between 16 and 20. For this class, I'm using a size 0, 8, and 16. These are the brushes I use 99% of the time, and I haven't really needed any other shapes or sizes to get the results I'm after. I know there are differing opinions out there, and if you have found another brush that you use and love, please use it. There's no wrong answer, but there really is no need to go out and spend a ton of money on a whole bunch of brushes if you really only need a few. We could spend hours talking about different watercolor paints and brands, but I'm just going to focus on what I've used personally and what the differences are between them. When I first started, I had no clue about what the real differences in paints were, and so I just bought this $5 palette at my local craft art supply store. I was drawn to it because it has so many colors and it made me excited to start painting. These are great as far as color options, but the quality of paint is just not good. If you've ever used these, you'll notice that they dry very quickly and you're constantly having to re-wet the paints in order to use them. They also dry with a chalky finish, which doesn't give off that nice transparency that I love about watercolors. You'll notice that I didn't jump right into using the professional grade paints, and I slowly moved my way up to them. If I was starting again, knowing what I know now, I would have just sprung for the professional grade paints right off the bat. I know it's intimidating to use the nicer paints if you're just getting started, but I wanted to show you the difference in quality so that you can make an informed decision. The next sets I purchased were from Premium Marketing Inc. I really love their palettes, and I had so many of their little tins that I purchased a bigger tin from Amazon to keep them all in one place. These are a higher quality than Artist Loft, but they still have a bit of an opaque finish to them. I don't need to re-wet these quite as often as with the Artist Loft pan set. So after the Premium Marketing Inc., I just kept purchasing nicer pan sets because I had no clue what colors to get. I really didn't know what the real difference in quality was, so I just kept buying more expensive pan sets, thinking that more expensive meant higher quality. And they do in some cases. This Yarka set is around $100 depending on where you buy it, and I used it for a really long time before I moved on to my tube paints. These are high quality, but you're stuck with the colors they've already picked out that come in the set. If you're ready for high quality paints, you really should just invest in tube paints because you can really customize your palette and get exactly what you want. Let's move on to tube paints. Tube paints come moist in a tube. One big mistake I see people making with tube paints is that they don't dry them completely on their palette before they begin to paint. So many artists will say that drying them is optional or a personal preference. And in a way it is, but let me tell you why I think it's a mistake not to dry them first. First of all, you'll waste a lot of paint if you use them wet. If you dry out your paints first, you're not likely to go through your paint nearly as fast. I will maybe use one 5 milliliter tube of paint over the span of a year if I'm good about drying my paints completely first. Another reason you'll want to dry out your paints first is you'll have more control over how much water you're adding into your paints and you'll get a truer color. I've found that when I'm using my paints wet, they look a little bit more opaque and like a big thick blob of paint on my paper rather than that nice transparent quality that I love about watercolors. You'll need to purchase a palette to put your paints on. My favorite is the Magello Bulletproof palette. This one is great because it rinses completely clean. Other palettes I've used always have a slight color stain on them once they're rinsed off, but this one looks brand new every single time, which I love. In this class, I'm using a Magello brand, but it's not the Bulletproof, so you'll be able to see a little bit of a color stain on it. Honestly, you're welcome to use whatever palette you have, but the Magello Bulletproof is my absolute favorite. I'll show you how I set up my other Magello palette in the next lesson. There are several different brands of tube paints. I recommend getting professional artist-grade paints if you're going to do tube paints. The brands I love and recommend are Winsor & Newton and Daniel Smith. Schmincke, M-Gram, and Holbein are also really great high-quality tube paints. You'll want to avoid any paints that say student grade on them. Here are the Winsor & Newton Cotman student grade tube paints. And then here are the professional grade watercolor tube paints. They're really similar in color, but you can really see that the professional grade is more vibrant and colorful, and the quality is just really noticeable. In the next lesson, I'll show you exactly what colors I recommend for getting started and how to prepare your palette.